Hi, hello everyone, and welcome to our 1 o'clock, because I'm not on Central Standard Time. Our 1 o'clock panel, conversation telling on ourselves, um, South Carolina Black narratives. So it's going to be a dialogue, uh, the three of us for now. And so we're looking at how narratives, essays, and memoirs have been a longstanding avenue through which Black people have shared their story in a world determined not to hear them. So we're going to talk specifically to Black South Carolinians about how we've made, and I'm one of them, so how we've made our stories public, or with the help of others, make other people's stories public. So our phenomenal guest for this afternoon conversation is Latreia Graham. She's a writer, editor, and cultural critic currently living in South Carolina, but working in other locations. Her writing interest revolves around the dynamics of race, gender norms, class, nerd culture, and even football. She works with publishers invested in celebrating the diversity of the human experience, particularly online publications that focus their attention on social justice and equality. So speaking with people who challenge status quo and care about and learning without inhibitions. Our second panelist and guest is Herb Frazier, a writer based here in Charleston, South Carolina. He serves as special projects editor for the Charleston City paper, former marketing director for Magnolia Plantation and Gardens in Charleston, edited 5 newspapers in the South, including Charleston's own, the Post and Courier. He is the author of Behind God's Back, Gullah Memories, and authors of We Are Charleston, Tragedy and Triumph at Mother Emanuel with Marjorie Wentworth and Dr. Bernard Powers. And he is also co-editor with the late Horace Mungeon on Ukulele, searching for healing truth. South Carolina writers and poets examine American racism. He has a book coming up, co-written with Joseph McGill, Sleeping with Ancestors, Slave Dwelling Matter. And today I'm moderator, Dr. Tamara Butler, serving as the executive director for the Avery Research Center for African American History and Culture. I am also a vintage clothing enthusiast. I write mostly in the field of English education, and really excited. I have a co-authored book that doesn't focus on South Carolina, but it is written with a fellow South Carolinian, Dr. Valerie Kinlock, and the book is entitled Where is the Justice? So I want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I'm also taking a breath. All right, so one of the things, so we're going to jump right in, and I'm going to ask you. This question is out for both of you. Kind of, what are you working on? We mentioned your projects. What are you working on currently, and how do you think it addresses or brings to the forefront some of South Carolina's history, and/or the idea of storytelling and narrative writing? I turn it over to whoever wants to go first.
Go ladies first.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you. So, something that wasn't mentioned in there that I've been sort of hush about is that I'm also working on a book. It's called Uneven Ground, and it was purchased by HarperCollins, and so I'm working on that. And it's about Black people and land loss, and that is because in 2020 I had to auction my father's section of a 100-acre family farm that's been in our family for over 100 years. Heirs property and all of the things that are done to separate Black people from land. I'm a fifth generation farmer. And so land was, in many ways my inheritance and the things on it and the stories in it, in the actual soil. So I do talk a lot about that. But I also had to do the work of figuring out where we came from. Right. In many ways, like they couldn't be my grandfather. They had no idea where my great grandfather was from. There was a lot of shame and silence and like kind of rattling those cabinets and opening those doors and sort of finding shit manifest out, where we entered the country and how long. I'm an amalgamation of enslavers and the enslaved and all that meant, and really unwinding some of those. It's a 500-year look at South Carolina, going back to that, Spanish establishment in Georgetown, South Carolina. So, very the enslaver side of my family came in through Savannah in 1733 on the Georgia Pink. He did not allow lawyers enslaved people liquor or Catholics. They decided that they did not love those things and they wanted enslaved labor, so they moved to South Carolina where it was permissible. And by 1738, they're so from that point on forward, I'm trying to look at and untangle some of the history about my family and why we stayed in many ways when other folks, other places in the country through the Great Migration and even before that with westward expansion. But something that I think of, and I'm curious how you all feel about this, of what happens in America starts in Charleston and starts in South Carolina, in that little section of the Low Country.
Okay.
And so moving forward that way.
Okay, thank you.
And so that's kind of where a lot of sort of revolves around, and knowing that my family came in through the South Carolina Low Country, and migrated to Newberry County where they've stayed for the last 100+ years, and what it means to lose it. So that's a long-winded answer, but gives you some idea of my connections to South Carolina and what I'm pushing and pulling on myself now.
I don't think it's a. We got stories to tell. It's a cluster of writers. I mean, it wouldn't be a writer conversation if we didn't have thorough answers. I'm really excited about this project. I'm kind of glad you kept it under wraps, because I might have came on here doing cartwheels, because I teach a course on Black women's connections to land, and I'm really interested in getting students to think about Black land loss. I started it when I lived in Michigan, and getting students to understand, like, though you live all the way, still have land that you may be stewards of, and that you in the future, but that you might actually be that kind of person that developers or somebody might reach out to. So you need to have your own understanding of your relationship to land. Yes. All right. I want to before I let you jump in, Mr. Frazier, we had a guest join in, tapping in. It's kind of like wrestling, So we got someone standing on the sidelines. So we have writer Teresa Jenkins Hilliard. She is a Gullah storyteller, teaching artist in residence, certified Charleston tour guide and local historian. Also owner of Mama Duke's Gullah. She's been featured in various publications and television shows. I could list them all, but we'd be here for a minute because she's been everywhere. She's written 3 books, including Mama Duke's Gullah recipes, and has a line of Gullah Geechee spices. Member of the Charleston Gospel Choir, performed gospel and old Negro spirituals throughout the continent of Europe. Also presented at major art festivals. Holds a bachelor's degree of science from SIU, and is married with 3 children and 10 grandchildren. So we want to welcome you also to the stage. So the question that I tossed out, no problem. The question that I tossed out to the team was really, what is your current project that you're working on? And how does it connect to history or narrative telling, storytelling? And so I don't know if Mr. Frazier wants to go first, and Ms. Hilliard, let us know if we want to make sure we can hear you, because you're muted right now. Just want to.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yes.
All right. So, all right. Go ahead. Who wants to go? You want to go?
Well, I'll go.
Okay.
Give Ms. Hilliard a minute to think about the question, since she just joined us. Well, it's good to be here with you all today. Dr. Butler, you mentioned the current work, Ukulele, Searching for Healing Truth, South Carolina Writers and Poets Explore American Racism. This book is an anthology of poems and essays that was released last year, February, by Evening Post Books. It's the result of about a year and a half of writing, thinking, editing, between myself and my co-editor, the late Horace Mungeon. The book covers a wide range of stories, personal accounts about the African-American experience, mostly from the lens of Charleston and South Carolina. We also touch on heirs property in this book. And we hope to do more with this, we have a cadre of 47 very talented and passionate people about telling the true narrative of the African American experience in not just Charleston, but of course the entire United States. The other thing that I'm working on that I have not talked about much is I'm helping a former educator, Dr. Walter Tobin in Columbia, South Carolina, tell his incredible story of his journey in education, which began before desegregation. And he got into K through 12 education when there were segregated schools, and he watched and experienced that transition into desegregated schools. And he was superintendent of several small rural county school districts in South Carolina. So he has an incredible story to tell. And right now I'm helping him write basically not kind of a mini bio, but it's more of a kind of a primer for young education teachers and principals and young superintendents on what to do and what not to do to make schools successful and to help students. And that's the primary driver behind Dr. Tobin's mission as an educator. And you mentioned, Dr. Butler, that Hachette Books will soon release Joe McGill's, the book that I'm writing with Joe McGill. It will be released June 6th. The book, the initial title was Sleeping with the Ancestors, Slave Dwellings Matter, but it's now Sleeping with the Ancestors, How I Followed in the Footsteps of Slavery. For the last 12 years, Joe McGill, who's founder of the Slave Dwelling Project, has traveled the United States and slept in slave dwellings in 25 states. He initially called for the preservation of these structures, but his work grew into more than that. It has sparked a very sharp and sometimes heated debate around race relations in the United States. But the primary mission, two things that we're really thrusting for in this book, is to tell how important it is to save these structures, because they tell an important narrative of how Black people built this country. And most importantly, it is an opportunity to hear the voices from the ancestors. So in this book, we use archival resources to really bring forward the voices of the formerly enslaved and the enslaved, who talk about their condition when they were enslaved. So that's something that we're really, really excited about, bringing forward and honoring the ancestors in this work.
That is amazing. I'm excited. I'm going to circle back with questions about archival research and
Yes.
research shortly. So you know that's coming.
Yes. Okay.
So I'm excited about this project for all kinds of reasons. So all right, Ms. Jenkins Hilliard, it's your turn. What are you working on? What should we know? Welcome to the stage. What are you working on? How does history inform the work that you're working on?
Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to be here today. Well, I'm working on telling my story about how I grew up on Edisto Island with my grandmother, whose only language was Gullah, and she was the custodian of her grandchildren. When the Great Migration, that my mother, her generation, they went to the big cities and to look for work. So the grandchildren, and that was typical of those in the Gullah Geechee culture back then, where the parents left the island looking for a better life and left the children under the guardianship of the grandparents. And that's what my family was about. So I've been actually chronicling this for the past 15 years, really. I ended up writing other things and still haven't published this one, because it's so much encompassed in it that it's like, I says, now, what can I leave out, and what do I need to put in, and it was just so much because I was just telling my story and writing it for my children so that they would know the history, and it didn't start out to be a publication, but then it's growing into something that I would like to publish one day. But I just have to just sort of zoom in on it and determine how I'm going to write it, what I'm going to say, and all of that. So that is one thing, and that's sort of a huge project for me. And hopefully one day I will get it out. And I'm working on some children's books because I had a lot of experience as a child growing up on the island, and a lot of the stories, real life stories that I would share with my children and grandchildren, and they thought that it was just something that was just funny, and some of the stories, and they thought that this really happened, and I says, yes, it did. So I've been writing those stories off and on for the past maybe 5 years or so. So I have several of those stories that are real life stories for me growing up on Edisto Island. You know, I share a lot of those stories as I do my Gullah storytelling, but I want to do perhaps a collection. I'm just trying to determine whether I would make it a collection of short stories, or to just do a book about each one of the stories. So that's a project that I'm working on, and also I have I'm one of those people with the Gullah Geechee land out on the island, and I have been exploring options for generating generational wealth for my children with that land, and just still seeking and trying to find out ways to do that. I don't know where to start, or and I am very fortunate that it's not tied up in ears property. It's been straightened out, so I don't have to worry about that. But I don't want to just get rid of it. I want to explore generational wealth for the next generation.
Yes, that makes sense. I mean, I think there's what I've seen as I see that it's like, what do you do with the land?
Mm-hmm.
And how do you work with land? I think when I teach, I love this quote that that land is a black eternal co-conspiring ancestor.
Wow.
And so I think about that often, of like what everyone's sharing, right? Whether it's being at live at the site of a slave dwelling, whether it's the land that your family grew up on, whether it's the land that your family currently owns or has to sell. It's like land has always been a co-conspirator. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I want to open up the conversation just a little bit to think about this concept of research. And so how do each of you go about what does your research process look like? Right? Especially if you're writing about your family, your own family. So what does that research look like? Or if you're writing about someone else, I mean, you have to go dig in the archives. Tell us a little bit about, what do you do? So me, for example, I'm a note junkie. Like, I can't tell you how many index cards and post-it notes and journals with index cards, and I'm like, it's probably not the best way to do a thing, but it's like I have an idea and I want to approach a thing. What does that process look like for each of you? Good.
Okay. Well, my process is, I have so many journals. I am talking about journals after journals after journals with just years of writing. I don't do too many of the stickies or things like that. I like to put it in a pad, a tablet, a notebook, whatever. So I have many notebooks. I was visiting our children for the holidays, and my son, I went in his office, and he had all these notepads. And I says, "You're just like your mother. I've got," and he says, "That's where I got it from." I mean, just notepads upon notepads with years of just things. And that's what I do with my I do research. I've gone to, of course, Avery and the South Carolina room, the Preservation Society. I've gone to the State Archive. And I've done quite a bit of research. I've been on, Ancestry.com and the Mormon Church and everywhere, looking up my ancestry and getting information about my family on all sides, because I've got maternal, my grandparents on my grandmother's side, and of course on my father's side, my mother's side. So there's so many dynamics to the Black culture because of the dynamics. We have roots. Our roots extend all over the place. So I am learning so much about my history, and I've been able to go all the way back to the 1800s. My great grandfather, who was the son of the enslaver, and his mother. So I am extremely happy to have been able to go back that far. So I know from the plantation where they were, and my great white grandfather. So I've been researching ever since I retired. I mean, extensively for the last 15 years since I retired from the federal government. So I've been doing a lot of that and jotting it down, and books and books and books and journals of all of this information. And it's frankly, it's so overwhelming. And that's why I can't seem to get this book done, because all of the information that I've collected, it's so extensive, and it's so much that I haven't a clue how to put it together.
Who wants to jump in? I know everybody has a process, right? So I want to hear people's processes, because I get nosy and hoping that maybe I can be more effective in my own process.
Well, my process, one day I was gathering some information, and I described myself to me as a Hoover vacuum cleaner. I was just on a tear. I was sucking up information. I'd go online, I'd get information. I'd go to the library, and then I'd, get books and from every and anywhere I'm getting information. So yes, Ancestry.com has been helpful, particularly when it comes to finding information about the enslavers, particularly when the book that I'm doing with Joe McGill, that I've done with Joe McGill, we want to document the enslaver, and then we'll turn to the slave narratives, the WPA slave narratives, and there's a lot of information there. There's a lot of information sometimes in Black newspapers, back in the 20s and 30s that I found. I found some things in of course, the Library of Congress. It's wonderful that all of that is online. The Low Country Digital Library is a great resource. Avery, of course, is a great resource. Avery was a very good resource for my first book that I did, Behind God's Back. So I just look everywhere. And I might add that one of the easy, well, this is not going to be easy. I thought it was going to be easy because one of the books that I really, really want to do is do a book on my travels around the world as a journalist, right? Reporting stories from Asia, Europe, Africa, the Caribbean. And I'm a pack rat. I have a whole bunch of stuff. I got the shed in the backyard with boxes and boxes labeled Cuba, Japan, Sierra Leone, South Africa. And I just put all that stuff in the box. And then at some point, I'm just going to kind of slowly go through that box, go through my memories, and then, of course, search the archives at the Post and Courier, because that's where all of these stories, most of these stories reside, and then start writing about that, remembering those emotions, the feelings, and the people I met along the way. So that's another book. After I get through with Dr. Tobin, I'm going to turn to that book. So I'm a Hoover vacuum cleaner, basically. I just go everywhere there's information to be had. And then, you put it aside. Sometimes you might find something that's interesting and you'll put it, you might say, I might not need that now, but I might need it later, So you just park it and you kind of remember, grab it, and you pull it out and say, aha, what is it now? So that's my approach.
I like it. What about you, Latreia? What do you have? So what's your process, especially because your book focuses on your family?
Yeah. So I realized that we all work really differently, and it's been intriguing to hear y'all talk. I am an ear hustler. Apparently I've been working since I was a small child, right? So I'm going to take y'all back. So I'm 36, but my grandmother was still shelling field peas. You know how you put them in the pillowcase and you knock them against stuff to like get them loose, right? So like women would come over and they would do stuff like that. And I'm down there, like my fingers hurt and I'm peeling, peas. And all this time I'm listening to stories. We're very much oral people in that way in my family. My grandmother had a 3rd grade education. My grandfather's education was questionable. And before that, like when you look at the census, so a lot of that, I'm always kind of underneath them, listening for stuff or listening for the stuff they don't want you to know that like they know to be true and stuff like that. So that's where I start with a lot of mine, was trying to put together things that I remember from childhood that I wasn't supposed to know, and then working backwards there. I'm also taking a little bit different. I'm taking, how do I say this? What is often seen as a more objective scientific approach. And what I mean by that is the way education values oral histories versus book learning versus scientific things has been uneven. Like they all three are important to me. And so something that I did when I started this book was I took one of those soil core samples and I put it in the ground. I chose 7 sites that were important to my family. And I took the soil and I had it tested. I wanted to know what I feel like that soil holds part of my blood, it holds my stories, and I wanted to know what that soil was composed of and how they related to me as a person. All the major DNA ancestry sites, including African ancestry, because one of the hard things in this book is a lot of the physical sexual abuse and violence that my family did not talk about, and the philandering happening. And my dad dies. He does not leave a will. I know I have one much older half brother, but I could have up to 8 siblings, where I was raised with only the 2 of us in the house. So finding ways to know what I might know, like using science outside of myself in that way to look at some things, in addition to census records and ancestry and archives. And something else that I'm doing that I want to shout out Dr. Tia Miles for, and all that she can, is like there are certain things that members of my family considered shameful that they never spoke about, that I can only find parts of in an archive. And so I have to look into archives and places like Red Cliff Plantation. I spend a lot of time going to sites like that plantation, saying, okay, this was the nature of what was happening at this time in this space. These are things that people, and these sorts of policies and regulations would have applied to my family, even if I don't have that direct link. So I'm doing a lot of that narrative bridging I first found out, really, I think about that technique. So lots of archival and pulling things. But yeah, I started with the ear hustle because like some of that stuff, my tagline is I'm writing things that there's no Wikipedia entry for, right? That like aren't necessarily on the radar, and then going through and trying to sift it out and figure out what's true, right? Or figure out and confirm some of the things we were told or that we heard, and moving that line, that's where the tension is, right? Versus some of the things that they allowed or were proud of being documented.
I think the thing that I hear across the three of us is also, or I'll pull myself in, is two things. One, you talk about kind of creating an archive, right? So thinking about what Mr. Frazier said in terms of like, I have all these boxes and then I just go back in them and make sense of like, how did I feel? What did I think of? Same thing with you, Miss Hilliard. It's just the same kind of concept. Like, well, I have all these stories. Which one do I actually write? And then thinking about Latreia in the sense of the soil is the archive. And the fact that you like stick something, you take the soil sample and you ask questions. But then the technique that I also see is an interesting, triangulation of trying to fill in the gaps, right? Bridging the narrative. I think Toni Morrison talks about getting behind the veil and seeing the intimacies, and imagining what's beyond this, what the archive tells us. And so it's fast. I love the idea of how do you take this quote unquote official record and put it up against another official record, right? An oral history that you overheard. How do you put it up against the one that's been passed down? In my family, I've been looking at family reunion T-shirts as another form of record keeping. And it says that it tells you who lives in a neighborhood, like who came to. There's a lot of rhetorics behind family reunion T-shirts, right? But when you put it all together, you get a much wider story than what might be captured in the records. My favorite story I tell is about my grandmother. So I'm hoping that this book will be a chance of me. It really started as me trying to track down my great grandmother and realizing that throughout my childhood, people say I look like this woman I never met, but her photograph is in everyone's house. And so in doing that, you go back through the official record and it says that this woman at some point gave birth to twins, though she's born in Wabala, gives birth to twins in New York, but comes back and has more kids. And I'm just like, wait a minute, no, wait, somebody, just if you could explain to me how that happened and why that happened. And we're talking about twins at the turn of the century, right? Like my great grandmother having kids at early 1900s. And so it's just a lot of like how we take those pieces, put them together, and really think about what story are we wanting to tell. And I also want to say quickly is that what I think this group helps us see is that our stories are valuable, and that the process of research is valid. Because so often, people come to Avery and they're like, where are the Gullah Geechee people? Where can I find them? And I was like, hey, right here. But it's also important because young people who live in these communities and people of all generations realize like your story is important, right? You have an archive, either one you've created or one that somebody has gifted and shared down with you, that you have the ability to transform into a story or stories, and share with others. And so I just want to say thank you all for demonstrating to us how we are archivists, right? You're storytellers, that you're researchers, you're all of those kind of mushed into one person in a hat you wear at any time.
I just
So
wanted to add,
yeah,
oh,
go ahead.
wanted to add one thing. My grandmother's generation, and certainly the generation before that, they were that silent generation.
Mm-hmm.
They did not talk at all. But the other thing is we didn't know to ask either, because we didn't know anything about our history. We didn't find out all of these things until after most of that generation was gone.
Mm-hmm.
And I could think of so many things that I would have asked had I known, but I didn't know. They never shared, they never talked about it. So the generation just above mine, like my mother's generation, when you knew to ask some things, they would say, I don't want to talk about that. So they would not, they were just as bad as the silent generation because they wouldn't talk about it either. But I was very fortunate that when they got into their 90s, that's when I found out all the oral history, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I really feel so fortunate to have been able to convince them or to ask them, and they were now willing to tell me. So then I got all of this oral history. You know, I've got tapes, you know, the videotapes and some just recording. And of course, like Mr. Frazier, I've got a file cabinet full of, you know, clippings of this and clippings of that and clippings. It's bulging over. And I says, I'm not going to buy another file cabinet to put any more things, but I may have to. Or I may have to resort to building a house in the backyard, Mr. Frazier, to put those things in. But I mean, it's overflowing. And then I've got all of these, you know, oral histories. So it's, you know, if you have to listen to all of that and go through all of the clippings and everything, I don't know if I'll ever get this book. I'll ever get this book published. But I was very, very grateful because those secrets, like you said, Dr. Butler, that actually Latria mentioned about those secrets that you weren't supposed to know, you know, about these siblings and half siblings and stuff that you had. And you grew up with them. In my case, I grew up with a brother that we went to church together, played together, all this, had no clue that we had the same father until I was an old lady, basically. I mean, we could end up marrying each other or something. But yeah, but those, you know, those secrets, you don't know. And when you find out about it, you're like, what? You know, but then you're finding out when they get a little relaxed in their 90s. And that's when they were able, when they were willing to divulge this information and tell those secrets that would have never been told otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
I'd like to make a point that I think that, and I was surprised. Well, I always knew that Black newspapers that operated in their heyday in the 30s, 40s, 50s, that they were valuable resources. But I did not know, and I think I've got the date right, that back in the 1870s, there were Black newspapers in which formerly enslaved people ran ads in these newspapers looking for their family that was broken apart as a result of one member of the family being sold away from the plantation. And that shocked me. And Joe and I, we talk about this in the chapter in the book when we talk about family reunions, because Joe has interacted with the descendants of enslaved people at various plantations around the country, and he's been to a few of those plantations. So, you know, that whole everybody goes to a family reunion now. But, you know, that tradition started, you know, before the turn of the 20th century. Yeah.
Oh. So that, to piggyback a little bit on what Ms. Hillard said, in you know, in their 90s, they're willing to relax and talk about these things. My folks don't live that long, right? 62 is what we get. So it is like that oral history component for me, like, does not, like, my urgency is that, like, nobody in my family lives that long. I don't know how long I've got to. I know that sounds grim, but that puts that forward momentum behind me, because I'm the last person in my family that knows what happened on that land. I am the last farmer. I'm the last of something, and totally understanding that. So I am in both the patience and persistence to interview folks in their days, because that is not a thing I get. And I marvel at it. I also have to make room for the grief of not being able to have that, right? Not having any of my grandparents as a full adult over the age of 30. Like, everything that I find, I don't know how my grandparents, my maternal grandparents met right? And my mom, who is 63, doesn't know, right? And everything that comes with that, because they were so silent. Figure out what circumstances put them in places that they might have crossed, and asking those questions. So I just think it's really cool that you have gotten to and continue to do that work, and I just wanted to speak on that.
Thank
One of the
you.
things I wanted to ask, because we did have it come up in the group, is how did you what advice, so as writers and as researchers, because I also have a fun question too, but what advice do you give? So I know that I'm going to call you doctor because you're out there teaching the grad students, but Latreia is working with students. What advice and what kind of strategies do you offer your students to get them to engage in narrative writing and telling their story? And then I also want to hear from our other panelists as well, but I want to start with you, of like, what do you share to get that kind of process going for students?
It's a little bit of a ladder of abstraction and working backwards. I get them to see that, like, they think they're normal or the default. Those understandings come out of something. They come out of a rule or a policy or anything. Their lives are shaped by natural, built, imagined landscapes and the policies and societal norms that dictate those things, right? And where do those things come from? How are they handed down? Either by, if you family unit, it's like the first question I ask folks often is, what is the story your family tells about you? When you're little and you do something and you don't remember it, but they do, and like how is that told, and what is that supposed to signify about you, right? What does it say about your family dynamic? What does it say about society? And then, if you could be the author of that story, what would you write? So it gets them to think about sort of units and those first stories. The other thing that I do, because so much of what I write about is my body in a place or body in a landscape or tensions against my body. Even when I'm profiling other people, forces are being enacted on their body, stressors, wear and tear in some ways. And everybody has a body. That is one of the few things that we have in common, no matter where you come from. And so I ask them things like, what messages did you get about younger? Do you still hold those messages, or have you let them go? Are they still useful to you? Talk about a time when your body has betrayed you. Talk about a time when you've betrayed your body. Because especially whenever we're talking about Black history, bodies as commodity, right? And as assets and that comes with it, and get them to see that their existence and their labor are all playing into a system that we are all part of, and how that those policies have been shaped by history, and specifically often slavery. So that's sort of they don't understand that that's what I'm doing at first. They just think I'm asking them to tell me a story, right? That's the most innocent thing anybody can ever ask you to do. Just tell me a story, right? But it tells you something about their value system and how they see the world. And that is when the work can begin in my classroom.
I love it. I'm going to keep going. What other advice do y'all have? What advice do you have for getting young writers or young of heart writers moving?
After the publication of my first book, Behind God's Back, in 2011, I had an opportunity to speak to a lot of school kids, high school kids in the Cainhoy, Hugie, Wando area, Daniel Island area. And when I was doing the research for the book, the people that I wanted to talk to were the people who were in their late 80s and 90s. I wanted to hear from them. How did they use the land? How did they farm the land? How did they use the land to sustain themselves through the Depression? Those people who worked in the Forest Service to build the Francis Marion National Forest, they were around at that time when that was done. And I was telling those kids, I said, you need to take your family, you need to take down with them and ask them questions and about anything. Because yes, I agree. I mean, when I was a kid, there were a lot of things that that my grandfather and father didn't tell me about. For instance, in the early 60s, when I was about 12 years old, I didn't know much about all the desegregation efforts that were going on in Charleston to desegregate Rivers High School, where Millicent Brown entered as a student, all the work that was going on, all the protests that was going on King Street to desegregate the lunch counters. I was a kid playing marbles. I didn't know any of that. I had to learn that later on as an adult, and I was very, very frustrated. I'm very frustrated as a result of that now. I wish I had a more personal knowledge of that, and it probably would have helped me. I know it would help me in some of the stories that I've told about that period in Charleston's history. And I'll end on the fact that one of the things that surprised me two things that surprised me when I was interviewing these old folks, some of the things that they told me that they did to survive. One man I met, Richard Roper, he shared with me the story of how his grandfather I think in the 1940s, how they grew rice on some land they had up in Cordsville, up in lower Berkeley County, and that helped them. They had a farm, they grew vegetables, but then they grew rice, and that was rather fascinating to hear him tell the stories of how they grew the rice, how they cleaned the rice and store the rice. But one of the from a lot of the older people, and these again, folks in their 80s and 90s, of how their parents made moonshine. They had farms, they could grow the food that they ate, but they made moonshine to get the cash that they needed to buy things that they couldn't produce themselves. And it was kind of striking to hear these folks, they grew up in the church and they just readily admitted, yes, my daddy made moonshine. And they said, look, you had to do what you had to do to support your family. And if it meant making moonshine, they made moonshine. They had a lot of corn too. So.
What about you, Mrs. Hilliard? Like you're a writer and you're a storyteller, right? Like an oral storyteller.
Yes.
So what's your advice for the young people out there wanting to write?
First, I want to say, it's talking about the corn and the moonshine. Of course, that living out there on Edisto Island, there were these huge oak trees. And you know how these trees had these limbs that just fall to the ground, and it covered everything. You couldn't even see the sky through those trees. And of course, there was a gentleman out there who made his moonshine, had a moonshine still, a whiskey still under one of those trees. And our pigs would come home falling down every day. They had a little path, and they would just come home, and they knew how to come home. Like that drunk man who, wherever he goes, he knows how to come home. Well, those pigs knew how to come home. So they would come down that little path, and when they got in the yard, they would just fall out. And we would take our feet and try to get them to move, and they would not move, couldn't do anything at all, because they had been going down to that whiskey still, eating that corn, the discarded corn that they used to make the moonshine. And we would say, Mommy, the pigs are dead. And Mama said, those pigs ain't dead. Them pigs just fine. And so I didn't know what was happening at the time, but I learned later on why those pigs were coming home drunk. But, I speak to a lot of people, and my favorite thing to do is talk to children. Go to the schools and do the residency in the schools. That's one of my favorite things. But I like talking about Gullah, my experiences everywhere, to everybody that will listen. And I tell them how I did not have the opportunity to sit at my grandmother's feet and hear, my history, because my grandmother, of course, that generation did not talk about it. And I asked them, do you have an opportunity to speak with your grandparents? And they would say yes. So I says, well, this is your opportunity now to sit at your grandmother's feet and hear your story, your history. I had to learn mine from research, and later on, of course, I was able to get some oral history. But I says, you have the opportunity, and it's time. And these are generally elementary school children. I says, you have an opportunity right now to sit down. And if you don't want to write it down, Go and get you one of those tape recorders. And I says, nowadays, every child have a telephone. So I says, hit that voice memo and talk to your grandparents and ask them how they grew up. Ask them questions, all the questions that you want to know. This is an opportunity for you to start that right now. So I try to encourage them to do this, oral interviews. Just sit there and ask them 20 questions, whatever it is. And I says, because you have an opportunity to research and research now, you can get yours firsthand from your parents and your grandparents. I says, if you still have your grandparents, that is your greatest resource. And I said, and I'm telling you from experience, and I wish that I had that opportunity. And now that you do, just be aware of it. You're going to want to know your history one day. And the time to begin learning it is now. So, and it's usually a diverse group of children, and it doesn't matter. It's not just about, the Gullah Geechee history and culture. It's about everybody because history is about everyone. Black history is everybody's history because, the Africans, of course, played a pivotal role in the economy of South Carolina, well, in the world, really. So I just try to encourage them, all of them. It doesn't matter what your nationality, race, or whatever, but to use your most valuable resource, and that is your grandparents, to get that information and just, document it. And then when you document it, just share it at the kitchen table, ask your parents questions at the kitchen table when you're doing your dinner, and then share it with other people as well, so that they will know. And the more you share it, the more I think you're interested in it, because other people are listening. And when you know that someone's listening and they're interested in your history, then that makes you want to learn more about it. So that's what I do to try to encourage. And then for the older people, when I speak with them, I encourage them to talk to their children, their grandchildren. I says, pull them in. And I says, sometimes, they love those, those devices. And I says, this is a way to say, all right, put that voice recorder on. I want to tell you all something. And I says, if you're going to involve the telephone or something that they can do, I think that they will be there. And I, just encourage them to pass this information on, and don't take it with them. Pass it on to the children. And if their grandchildren don't appear to be interested, then you tape it, so that they will have it, because they're going to appreciate it later, even if they don't right now.
Yeah. I mean, I think about, and then I'll want to switch gears a little, but I think a little bit about when I was started out this project. I went and talked to some seniors, some senior citizens, seasoned saints, at a local church. And it was hilarious because most of the women were like, no, I don't have anything to talk about. Right. And it was like, no, I don't really have any. Right. And I was like, but you do. And so what I found was sometimes it's also nice when the space is created. So whether you're at a family reunion or whether you attend a church with the population, there is a senior citizen program or something, nursing homes sometimes. Like, it's really important for people generations to share. Like you said, we're dealing with a generation that thinks of silence, or this is grown folks business. You don't need to know
That's
this
right.
thing.
Exactly.
But what I found was the kind of like interesting hyping up of one another, right? So I would say, tell me a story, and then tell me about growing up, and it'll be about 10 minutes later, 20 minutes later, 35 minutes later, and then next thing you know, they'll mention something, and they're like, oh, by the way, you should talk to such and such because she did this, and then the person walked past and they're like, I don't have anything to talk about, and now here we are 30 minutes later, right? So it's sometimes also helping by thinking about how people are connected, because I think so often the stories that we share and the stories that we hear actually demonstrate that our communities are a little bit more connected than what they may appear now. Right? Where I've had people tell me stories of how they used to go to their neighbor's house and they left the door unlocked, right? And the neighbor was like, just go ahead in there and get you a cup of sugar. Close the door on your way out, right? Or the party line was my favorite stories when they were like, there's one phone in the neighborhood. Everybody is like, all right, this phone call's for you. You got to run down the street and tell such and such that this person is calling. So it's also thinking about like it's a different time, but it demonstrated these communities were more connected than how they may be now. And I think that's also really important.
If I can
Sure.
piggyback on that a little bit, food memories for folks. I'm sure y'all probably know that too. So growing up on a farm, like wash pot cracklings, like taking those as a peace offering, or if there's something, if you know somebody's into muscadines or there's a seasonal thing that folks are into, like so y'all, some of my family members still make moonshine, but we won't talk about it. But muscadine wine, peach brandy, those old school things, right? You know how you used to little slip the bag or whatever. Like my grandmother was wash pot because we had hogs, and that reminded me of hog killing time, right? And community and all of that sort of stuff. But like it's old school thing, or like tea berry gum. My dad, like it was a vintage thing that I'd seen in a store somewhere, and they sold old candies, and I got that. And he's like, "Do you know about the tea berry shuffle or whatever?" And he's like, "It's a dance we used to do when this gum came out or something." And I was like, this is embarrassing, but I also remember it like 30 years later, right? Like it is those little cues or those little food memories or see little things like poke salad. I'm a little bit of a poke salad, right? And all that it, like how that meant survival for my family. And those little things are being like, I can grab you some poke salad, or do you want this, or any, those little things matter, because a lot of them have say now, but like the chitlin strut, covered that. And, you know, chitlins, depending on who you are considered, you know, almost taboo. And so pulling up those things out. And the other thing I was going to say was dispelling shame sometimes about actions that they had to make when all they had were bad choices, right? And being able to emote, you know, about that. It's particularly with women in my family, women in general, because sometimes like that is in the moment. And so talking about getting into some of those things. So yeah, I'll stop talking.
You're muted. You're muted, Mr. Fraser.
I'd like to piggyback on what you just said, and that is I grew up downtown Charleston, so I didn't grow up in a rural area, so I don't have those rich stories. But Ron Days called me an urban gullah. So I do remember, have vivid memories of the vegetable man coming to the street on the east side of Charleston, and then a man with a cart loaded with ice, with shrimp and fish. And then another truck would come through with the kindling wood and the firewood, because back in the early 60s, my grandmother cooked, who she raised me, she cooked on a wood burning stove before we got a gas stove in the project. So those were real simple, easygoing times, you know, when every neighborhood had a corner store, and you'd go to the corner store and you could buy, you know, loose cigarettes and broke cookies, you know. So those are the kinds of things that my grandchildren and my children, you know, they didn't experience that, and I share that with them, and they and particularly my children, one of whom is now in her 40s, and I think she's getting tired of the stories. But I said, you need to know these things, you know. So.
Yeah, you know, Mr. Fraser, I can relate to that, because my life was a sort of a dual life, because my mother, when all of the during that migration, most people went to Chicago, Detroit, New York, places like that. My mother, fortunately, went to Charleston. That was her big city. So I got the pleasure of coming to visit her in the summer when school was out in Charleston. And she lived on the project, 175A President Street. And I would spend time with her there. So, you know, I had the best of both worlds. So I know exactly what you're talking about with the vegetable man. And then the guy on the bicycle delivering the grocery, you know, he had this big basket on the bicycle, deliver the groceries. And the man, the bakery man that came with the stale or day old bakery products. He was a baker at the bakery, but then when the products, they couldn't sell it anymore, he would come and sell it to those in the projects, and the man, the vegetable man, and the shrimp and the swimp man, and all of those things. I can remember that. So I have that experience in the country with my grandmother in my early years, and those visits and visiting town with me, ma. You see, so I came to town and stayed with me and spend time with me before I go back out there on the country now. And then you know how you get there? You ride in the back of the post office or the postman truck. The postman truck, yes. So you would get there, and he would take you to Charleston and deliver you just like he was delivering mail. Delivered me to my mother on 175A President Street, and then when it was time to go back home, he would come. He wouldn't come to the projects, but then we would go to Spring Street, and then you get back in the back of the truck, and he took me home, and my grandmother was right there waiting for me. So I have experience in both worlds.
Yeah. Well,
that's good.
I'm going to say we had a great conversation. We're not going, the official panel ends here. But I want to make a few quick announcements. So one is you are welcome to stay and chat with us a little bit after to continue the conversation. So there's a post-panel discussion right after this session. And also I want to give a big shout out to the students over at Charleston Advancement Academy who are tuning in, and I hope y'all learned a lot about and about writing, and that you're also inspired to capture the stories that are in front of you. And so we hope that you'll stay tuned, get all the books that we shouted out. So go ahead and get your order in if you don't already got your order in for all the books that are out. And we look forward to seeing you at the rest of the festival. We'll be in person for some of it on Saturday, reception tomorrow for some. And also, we'll see you at Avery. We're also like to endorse this work. And so we want to really thank you so much. All of our panelists, big thanks. We'll be here, and y'all make it a phenomenal Thursday. I was going to say Friday, Thursday. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the invitation. Bye-bye, everybody.
Miss Hilliard, before we go, I gotta say this. My mother grew up on Etta Street.
Is that so?
I was fortunate.
Yeah. She was my stepmother. I didn't know my biological mother. My father, who was in the Navy, remarried when I was 9 years old.